So good morning and welcome to the final day of our conference. My name is Johann. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Princeton. One of the happiest days in my time as a graduate student at Harvard University was the day I discovered the Rawls archives in Pusey Library. Now, unlike so many of you at this conference, I was born too late to meet John Rawls in person. The archives, however, afforded me a precious and I thought quite intimate window onto one of the giants of 20th century philosophy. His personality, his work habits, the patient, painstaking, and meticulous way in which he constructed his philosophical system over many decades of work, all of these spoke to me quite clearly through the wealth of documents assembled in the archives. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend that you go and check them out. There's some real treasures to be discovered. And one of the undoubted highlights of the archive is Rawls's voluminous correspondence with interlocutors from around the world, from Harsanyi to Habermas. And almost the first thing I looked at that happy day was a box containing Rawls's correspondence from the years immediately following the publication of A Theory of Justice on future generations and the just rate of intergenerational savings, topics whose philosophical study Rawls had, of course, pioneered. One of Rawls's earliest and most incisive interlocutors on these issues was a young welfare economist named Partha Dasgupta. At the time his correspondence with Rawls begins, circa 1973, Partha Dasgupta was hard at work on a pair of articles on some problems arising from Professor Rawls's conception of distributive justice and on some alternative criteria for justice between generations. Both of these papers were published in 1974 and soon became classics in their own right. And for Dasgupta, they marked the beginning of a lifetime of engagement with questions of intergenerational justice and population ethics. So it's with tremendous pleasure that I present as our first speaker this morning, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. To this audience, he truly needs no detailed introduction. Suffice it to say that he is the Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and one of the foremost welfare economists and development economists of our time. The material that he'll be presenting to us today is derived from his Arrow lectures given at Columbia and Hebrew University, which will be published as a book by Columbia University Press in June of this year. The title is Time and the Generations, Population Ethics for a Diminishing Planet. Now, joining Professor Dasgupta on our panel are two of the best of a younger cohort of philosophers working on topics of intergenerational justice. So Clark Wolf is Professor of Philosophy and Political Science at Iowa State University, where he also directs the program in bioethics. He has written a series of important papers on population ethics, the just savings principle, sustainability, and the bioethics of environmental and technological change. And Clark tells me that right now, in close cooperation with engineers and scientists, he's working on a series of questions of policy choice for our food, water, and energy infrastructure. Last but not least, we'll hear a talk from Anja Karnein, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Binghamton University, where she teaches political philosophy and bioethics. Her book, A Theory of Unborn Life, From Abortion to Genetic Manipulation, was published by OUP in 2012. And Anja, I'm happy to say, has a prior connection to Harvard. Immediately after completing her PhD at Brandeis, she came here for a year as a visiting fellow at the Safra Center. So very happy to welcome you back to Harvard. Okay, and now without further ado, to our first speaker. Partha, over to you.
Well, you haven't got it wrong. I'm not Partha Dasgupta. I'm actually Tim Scanlon with a better tie. Right. Humanity's future will be shaped by the portfolio of assets we inherit and choose to pass on, and by the balance we strike between the portfolio and the size of our population. Assets are durable objects. Their durability enables us to save them for our own future, offer them as gifts to others, exchange them for other goods and services, and bequeath them to our children. Durability doesn't mean everlasting. Assets depreciate, machines suffer from wear and tear, trees die, people die. But they're not fleeting. Durability distinguishes assets from services. such as life performances, which vanish as soon as they're produced. It is true that a memorable performance is remembered long after, but memory of a performance differs from the performance itself. Memory confers durability to the performance by creating a substitute product. Recording serves a similar, in some ways more faithful purpose, but even though we enjoy a recording, it's the recording we're enjoying of the actual performance. An asset acquires its value from the services it provides over its remaining life. A refrigerator preserves food by keeping them cool. It provides the service until it breaks down beyond repair. The refrigerator's worth is an aggregate measure of the benefits it provides over its remaining life. In common language, to say an object is an asset is to convey the idea that it has positive worth. Assets are taken to be goods. But one virtue of moving from the literary to the formal is to extend the use of concepts so as to bring disparate objects under a common intellectual framework. We should note that assets not only contribute directly to our well-being, but indirectly too, as sinks for pollution. Contemporary carbon emissions into the atmosphere are a prominent example. One way to conceptualize pollution is to view it as the depreciation of assets. Acid rains damage forests, carbon emissions into the atmosphere trap heat, industrial seepage and discharge reduce water quality in streams and underground reservoirs, sulfur emissions corrode structures and harm human health, and so on. The damage inflicted on each type of asset, buildings, forests, the atmosphere, fisheries, human health, should be interpreted as depreciation. Resources are goods, while pollutants, the degrader of resources, are bads. Pollutants are the reverse of assets, and polluting is the reverse of conserving. It is a commonplace to call assets capital goods, but economists have traditionally confined the use of the term assets that are material, tangible that is, durable and alienable, a piece of furniture, an orchard, a lathe, and so on. One reason for the latter restriction was the desire to work with assets that can be measured and compared with one another. It's not enough to say that houses can be measured in physical units, floor space, for example. They need to be compared with other assets, such as automobiles. We need a common unit. Valuing assets is a way to do that. Goods that are both material and alienable can be exchanged in markets. You expected me to use the word markets sooner or later. As a possibly crude first approximation, market prices offer a measure of their value to us. What about a person's knowledge, skills, reputation, and state of health? They're non-alienable. Knowledge, skills, and reputation are also intangible. Nevertheless, contemporary economists include them on the list of capital goods by calling them human capital. We economists use market wages and salaries to estimate the value of human capital to the individual possessing it. The term human capital reminds us that assets can be ends, they can be means to ends, or they can be both. Reading is a pleasurable activity, but is also necessary in a job that requires literacy. Similarly, a person's health is both desired end for himself and a means to employment. Now, once you include knowledge, skills, reputation, and health in the category of capital goods, it's hard to know where to stop. Should you not include institutions, such as the state or the market system? There is then the temptation to go for broke and speak of institutional capital, knowledge capital, science and technology, for example, and cultural capital. Today, people even refer to religious capital. You could then take an extreme position by calling all assets capital goods. The problem, as always, with these matters is measurement. It is one thing to recognize that an asset has worth. It is another thing to measure that worth. Try, for example, to compare the value to a nation of good governance with the real estate value of its capital city. This will be a non-starter. So there are many ways of classifying capital goods. However, only one has proved useful in empirical work. Divide capital goods into three categories, and that's what I'm going to do here, and I'll show the power of doing it. Produced capital, buildings, roads, ports, machines, instruments. Human capital, population size, health, education, reputation, knowledge, and skills. Personalized knowledge. And natural capital, ecosystems, for example. The remainder, institutions and practices, more generally, social capital. Public and publicly available knowledge we call enabling assets, and I'll use that expression here, because they confer value to the three types of capital goods that I've just now mentioned by facilitating their use. So under this classification, there are three classes of capital goods and a wide range of enabling assets. But in order to aggregate disparate objects, we need a common currency. Utilitarians would measure the worth of a capital good by its contribution to aggregate utility. Here we should think of the contribution the capital good makes to human flourishing or well-being, and that's the term I'm going to use here. It transpires that the right way to aggregate the worth of the three classes of capital goods is to add them. I'll show you why. That's the social worth of the totality of capital goods to which the economy has access at any time. By the way, at this point, I want you to think of the economy in a very general, loose term. Could be an individual, could be a household, village, city, nation, and sometimes we think about the world as a whole. Okay? The pertinence of this remark will become clear in a minute. By social worth, we mean not only worth to people alive at that date, but also to future people. We call the social worth of the three classes of capital goods inclusive wealth. The qualifier signals the inclusiveness that the notion of wealth here differs from the one in common use in two ways. One, the social worth of capital goods, they're called accounting prices, are not necessarily market prices, so you'll be relieved. Have to move away from that. And two, in addition to produced capital, wealth includes human capital and natural capital. The inclusion of human capital says, among other things, that personal characteristics of the individual with access to a piece of capital equipment matter. A piano in the possession of somebody who can play the piano has a higher accounting price than it would have were it to be in the possession of someone like myself, innocent of music, other things equal, of course. A person's well-being is shaped by the extent to which her projects and purposes are realized. They, in turn, are rooted to her engagements, both with her own self and with others, which means accounting prices of assets and services are person-specific. It also means that the degree of fairness in the distribution of well-being influences accounting prices. And economies, institutions, and practices endow capital goods with their social worth, which is why we are calling them enabling assets. The same portfolio of capital goods would have greater worth to people if the society in question were to bring about changes to its institutions and practices that, for example, create greater trust among people. Those changes would express themselves through an altered set of accounting prices. A writing desk has a higher accounting price in someone's study than in a war zone. An economy can become wealthier simply by improving the quality of its institutions. That will be reflected in the accounting prices. A more familiar means of wealth creation is to ensure that net investment, aggregated across the three classes of capital goods, is positive. Why should we be interested in wealth, this inclusive notion of wealth? And you might be wondering what this got to do with Rawls, so I'll come to that in a minute. Called the numerical measure of well-being across the generations social well-being, and for the moment, you might put on the hat of a utilitarian, because that's the one which has been most explored. So if you like, for the moment, think of, when I say social well-being, the sum of utilities across time and people. Okay? A capital goods accounting price is the marginal contribution it makes to social well-being. We're now nearly where we have been heading. If assets in their totality are the basis of social well-being, and if accounting prices of capital assets measure the marginal contribution they make to social well-being, there must be an intimate connection between inclusive wealth and social well-being. So suppose an economy undergoes a small change. I'm going to call it a perturbation. If the change is accompanied by an increase in or decline in social well-being, then it is also accompanied by an increased decline in inclusive wealth. It's an if and if, it's an equivalence result. So two types of perturbations are covered by the theorem. One, perturbations that are occasioned purely by the passage of time. The idea of sustainable development is rooted to this kind of change. Example of the kind of question we ask here is social well-being likely to be higher tomorrow than it is today? Then the equivalence theorem says you may as well ask whether wealth, inclusive wealth, has increased, is likely to be higher tomorrow than today. Two, the perturbations that are caused by a shift in policy at a moment in time. The idea of policy evaluation is rooted to this kind of change. Example of the kind of question we ask is the wetland preservation project being proposed likely to increase social well-being? So you're reallocating capital goods if you undertake the project, and that if wealth has increased, it means it's a good project, measured in terms of social well-being. Now, the power of the theorem lies in the fact that you kick off with social well-being, but you look for data that are the means towards social well-being. That's the reason you're interested in it. And the fact that there are 3 types of capital goods which are included in this inclusive wealth, and the connection between them and social well-being, which melts them together, is of course the accounting prices. Okay? The power of this 3-way partition can be shown that, say you read Pinker, Steven Pinker, so the last of the sequence of books telling us how we've never had it so good. And there is a strong sense in which, in the aggregate, by the way. Yesterday's talks were less about the aggregate world as a whole. There, the items that were being considered were the first 2 categories, human capital and produced capital. Natural capital was kept aside. And you could have growth in both human capital and produced capital. And that's your truncated notion of wealth. Indeed, wealth is increasing. But on the other hand, if simultaneously the projects that we have been engaged in lead to a deterioration in natural capital, carbon concentration, of course, is one, which is why I introduced the notion of pollution earlier on, and species extinctions and so forth, then in parallel, the social value of the social worth of natural capital could be declining. And if that decline exceeds, in absolute terms, the gain in the first 2 categories, why then we might be living at the best of times, but we would simultaneously be living at the worst of times because we are really screwing the future, our descendants. Okay? So that's the way one wants to think about this. Okay, to invest in capital is to increase it beyond what it would be if there were to be no investment. So by investment, we shall mean net inclusive investment, that is net of depreciation. But inclusive investment is a trickier concept than we may imagine. The word investment carries with it a sense of robust activism. When the government invests in roads, the picture that is drawn is of bulldozers leveling the ground and tarmac being laid by men in hard hats. But the notion of capital here extends beyond produced capital to human capital and natural capital. That training people to be teachers is investing in human capital is simple enough. But to leave a forest unmolested doesn't suggest investment, but it is. It's to invest in the forest, to allow a fishery to restock under natural conditions and to invest in the fishery and so on. Now that suggests investment amounts to deferred consumption, but the matter is subtler. Providing additional food to undernourished people via, say, food guarantee schemes not only increases their current well-being, it enables them also to be productive in the future and to live longer. Because their human capital increases, the additional food intake should count also as investment. Okay? So the theorem seems to have quite a... So we may sum up. Inclusive wealth and social well-being are 2 sides of the same coin, whether we ask if society has progressed over time or whether we evaluate alternative policies at the same moment in time. Right. Now, the well-being equivalence theorem draws attention to the fact that no matter what conception of ends citizens may adopt, and now I'm going to be moving gradually towards to Rawls, the source of the means to those ends lies in a society's capital goods. Their accounting prices serve to tie them to the ends. The theorem says the weapons and human capital deployed by the state to abduct awkward citizens from their homes in the middle of the night are to be awarded very large, possibly unboundedly large, negative accounting prices. Likewise, steel put to use in making plows differs from steel used to manufacture guns. Accounting prices of capital assets depend on their location and the use to which they're put. All right. In the Principles of Justice, Rawls addresses the basic structure of society, something that's been gone through at length here. But Rawls needed to find a way to bind the generations together, and he found exactly, in my judgment, exactly the right object with which to do the binding. Rawlsian primary goods are the ingredients of a society's productive base. His saving principle addresses the transmission of inclusive wealth. Now, if this reads as a bizarre interpretation of what is probably the most intensively scrutinized treatise on political philosophy in the last 100 years, recall that an economist's inclusive wealth is the social worth of its entire stock of capital goods. That worth is shaped by the social environment in which people try to realize their projects and purposes. A society where citizens lack opportunities to meet one another freely and develop institutions that protect and promote trust among themselves will not prosper, which is why the social environment includes various forms of personal liberties and access to opportunities. That's Rawls' first principle and part B of the second principle. An economy's social environment includes its capital goods, and their social worth, large or small, depends on their character. Other things equal, an economy's capital goods has lower social worth if society is dysfunctional than it is well ordered. The claims of justice are over citizens' ability to create and access their productive base. Inclusive wealth is a measure of that productive base. Of course, an economy with inclusive wealth, to repeat, is not the same as social well-being or well-being in any sense, but the equivalence theorem says it moves in tandem with the object of interest. Now, but wealth, even inclusive wealth, smacks of materialism. And a worry that lies not only behind the criticisms of Rawls' theory by communitarians, but also the one lodged by Bernard Williams. After giving a favorable term of report on a theory of justice, Williams wrote, and I quote from it'll come back to me in a minute, the book. The list of primary goods, I'm quoting now, the list of primary goods does not plausibly look as if it had been assembled simply by from the consideration that they are uniquely necessary for pursuing anything. From that consideration, we're not likely to derive more than liberty. It is hard to see also how the parties could avoid the reflection available to them from their knowledge of general social facts that some of these primary goods, notably money, are more important in some societies than in others, unquote. Rawls included wealth among primary goods, not money, unless the economy in question is monetized. I don't know whether the misconception Williams suffered from about wealth is common, but as it is Williams who had that misconception, I imagine it is not uncommon. The wealth well-being equivalence theorem holds in all societies, not just in monetized ones. For a hunter-gatherer society, the list of capital goods would include the amount of territory the tribe commands, the supply of water it can count upon, the extent of game within reach, the quality of the hunting equipment, the infant survival rate, the number of able-bodied men and women, the number of old people, the repositories of tribal knowledge, and so forth. It doesn't matter whether the economy is monetized or whether exchanges are conducted through barter or social custom or the dictates of the tribal elder. Their worth, whether it is expressed in monetary units or in boar tusks, reflects the contribution they make at the margin to the well-being of tribal members. Whatever else a person needs, he needs capital goods. Behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, the citizen does not, of course, know the worth of these capital goods. For one thing, there is insufficient knowledge about the social environment that will prevail in the later stage of Rawls' thought experiment, e.g. whether it will be a property-owning democracy, for example. The veil is so thick that the chooser doesn't even possess a sense of his own good. But choice behind the veil is only the first stage of political engagement, or that's how I read it, and I think I'm going to be a bit bolder than I ought to in this company, but why not? The veil is so thick that, but choice behind the veil is only the first stage of political engagement. Citizens know that once the veil lifts gradually, they learn more and more about themselves and the world. They will probably want to establish institutions such as banks, charities, cooperatives, and mortgage and insurance companies. At the very least, a monetized economy. Choices over matters such as whether a natural monopoly is to be located in the private or public sector are made at a later stage of the thought experiment, when the veil has been lifted sufficiently. As the Rawlsian veil is lifted, inclusive wealth comes to have a more concrete magnitude. But even behind the veil, citizens know they will want primary goods if they are to pursue their projects and purposes, whatever they may happen to be. It is to misread Rawls, in my judgment, not to recognize the centrality of the temporal structure of the thought experiment he used to identify the principles of justice. The Rawlsian citizen is invited to identify the principles she would choose when they're to guide the allocation of resources in a world where, with the passage of time, she learns more and more about herself in the world and the world, which is why she's seen as making a commitment to herself of varying strengths. The strongest, the principles of justice, being the ones she makes when the veil is thickest. We're thus encouraged to think of a hierarchy of commitments, those made in a given stage being less firm than those in a previous stage. To me, this reading puts into perspective the phenomenal opening sentences of his treatise. And I quote, not that you need to be reminded, "Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected or revised if untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well-arranged, must be abolished if they're unjust," unquote. One reason the Rawlsian citizen wants to choose the principle behind a thick veil is that by so doing, she is able to tie her hands so as to better exercise her options as and when her ignorance is lifted. The principles of justice serve as commitment device for future flexibility of choice. Current uncertainty about future circumstances and the fact that many of the choices she makes or is made on her behalf are irreversible, e.g. whether to learn to read and write in the early years of one's life, give value to keeping her options open for us for as and when occasions arise. The priority rules Rawls thought he had arrived at can be questioned, but that should not detract from the truth that Rawls's primary goods point to a society's productive base, nor that the distribution of primary goods reflects the distribution of inclusive wealth and thereby the distribution of personal well-being. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking Michael Rosen, Mr. Sekera, and all of the people who made this symposium possible. I am humbled and awed to be invited to be part of this. It's just a remarkable conference for me. I missed the Star Wars seminars at Oxford, but I kind of feel that I got a sense of what they must have been like in the sessions here. So in the spirit of this conference, I'd like to invite you to consider the problem impressed so eloquently on us yesterday by Lucas Stanzik, his former neighbor whose predicament leaves her unable to save, unable to acquire basic security from illness and poverty, compelled by circumstance to work multiple jobs, to provide basic goods for herself and her children. The circumstances of life for many people involve humiliating subjection to the will of others, subjection to circumstances of poverty, deprivation, precarious possession of basic necessities, in this case, which put her at risk of the ability to express her values in the way that she could shape a life. These are circumstances that threaten the very ability to live a worthwhile life, as Rawls recognized, a life that expresses the ability to adopt, rationally revise, and pursue a conception of the good. People whose waking lives are entirely occupied at keeping misfortune at bay are guided not by the pursuit of a rationally adopted good, but by aversion to obvious and objective misfortunes. They may lack the circumstances necessary for the exercise of Rawls' two moral powers. And correlating to this, in her remarks, Christine Korsgaard emphasized the conception of good in Rawls, but the avoidance of life-crushing evils may be even more important, in a sense, than the acquisition of rationally recognizable goods. Perhaps there's more agreement about bads than goods. We in this room want many different things, and our desires may be thoughtful and rationally chosen in the way that Korsgaard describes. The goods we want are surely plural, but perhaps there were less plural in our aversion to humiliation and oppression and poverty and precarity and other fundamental bads. Some views, most notably standard economic utilitarian views, encourage us to treat bads as negative goods. But with Karl Popper, I'm convinced that this is a very serious mistake. Our aversion to humiliation and subjugation are not parallel to any positive desire I can think of. It seems to me that the moral significance of the greatest goods we desire pales in significance when compared to the life-crushing evils we might hope to avoid. Many of these are in no way positional bads. Their badness is absolute, and when properly described, our horrified aversion to them may well be universal and in a sense rationally requisite. Just as a theory of good need not be consequentialist or utilitarian, we need not reduce bads to misery and consequential losses, loss of self-respect, loss of control of our lives, loss of effective agency. These are harms that are incompletely described in their utilitarian formulations. This distinction between good and evils is morally significant in a way that Rawls might have made more central to his moral and political works, but the distinction is certainly present. and it has, I believe, a central role to play in his theory of intergenerational saving. Rawls' account of intergenerational justice is regarded by some as a failure, and Rawls himself seems to have regarded his remarks on this topic to have been unsatisfyingly incomplete. But some of the most critical treatments of this aspect of Rawls' theory were, I think, too quick to reduce that theory to the principles of justice or even to the difference principle itself. And to do this is to leave much too much behind. The principles of justice are motivated by a set of underlying reasons, by an animating conception of reciprocity, by underlying considerations of what people need to have in order to exercise the two moral powers. And to understand how higher level aspects of Rawls' views should be interpreted, we can refer to the underlying motivational commitments that animate them. This allows us also to ask whether Rawls' own expression of his view adequately accounts for the reasons that give them shape. I will argue that Rawls' account of intergenerational justice is much clearer than it's usually recognized to be. I think we can understand this view better if we keep in mind those underlying reasons that animate the conception of justice as fairness, Rawls' conception of persons, and the distinction between the bads saving may enable our descendants to avoid, as compared with the goods that it may allow them freedom to pursue. So on saving, shortly after the publication of Theory of Justice, Rawls' treatment of intergenerational saving was addressed in important papers by Robert Solow, Kenneth Arrow, and of course by Partha Dasgupta. These papers addressed a view, primarily addressed a view that Rawls himself rejected, the intergenerational application of the difference principle, a view that Solow called plus Rawlsian que le Rawls, if I can say that well. These papers showed formally what Rawls had argued in the text. The difference principle can't serve, he argued, as an adequate principle for intergenerational distribution because it would forbid intergenerational saving altogether. Rawls understood saving as a way to make later generations better off than earlier ones. But if the first generation saves, then it must avoid consuming whatever is saved, making the members of the saving generation worse off than they would otherwise have been. To save to make later generations better off, therefore, requires that the first worst off generation will make sacrifices on behalf of their better off descendants, which is exactly the kind of redistributive scheme that the difference principle would forbid. This is the view that Rawls rejected. In other places, we get a clearer picture of what Rawls' more positive view was. And I think in The Law of Peoples, Rawls provides the most succinct presentation of his account of intergenerational saving and its purpose. It seems evident, though, that he regarded this view described here to be an explanation of the view that he developed earlier in section 44 of theory. So in LOP, Rawls writes, "The purpose of a just, real saving principle is to establish reasonably just basic institutions for a free, constitutional democratic society or any well-ordered society, and to secure a social world that makes possible a worthwhile life for all of its citizens. Accordingly, savings may stop once just or decent basic institutions have been established. At this point, real saving, that is net additions to real capital of all kinds, may fall to zero, and the existing stock only needs to be maintained or replaced, non-renewable resources carefully husbanded for future use as appropriate." Rawls' view here describes a two-stage process. Before fully adequate institutions have been established, the purpose of saving is to ensure that fewer people will suffer deprivation in later generations than in earlier ones. No citizen should be doomed to live in a social world that excludes the possibility of a worthwhile life. But once sufficiency has been achieved, that is, once decent or just institutions are in place and no one is deprived of this opportunity, saving may drop to zero. Of course, even at that stage, sustainable use of essential resources must still be avoided. Unsustainable use must be avoided as a form of dissaving, since it would unjustly doom members of subsequent generations to circumstances of deprivation. It seems clear to me that Rawls is here describing a kind of sufficientarian condition on intergenerational justice and saving, quite different from the views he's often criticized as having defended. The goal of saving is not to make later generations rich, but to secure adequate social circumstances that make possible a worthwhile life for all citizens. Just a few further comments. Certainly, the view described here makes assumptions about population size. If population size is increasing, then merely preserving an existing capital stock may be insufficient to provide for subsequent generations the benefits of institutions and goods that are required. Second, Rawls has in mind saving that will leave later generations better off than earlier ones. He doesn't really consider the predicament of declining natural resources that progressively degrade from one generation to the next, leaving later generations worse off than earlier ones. In that case, perhaps it's our case. The goal to minimize deprivation in subsequent generations might not merely permit, might require saving and other policies to protect the sufficiency interests of later generations. Certainly, what we might regard as saving might in fact be the avoidance of certain forms of dissaving on this view. Third, I think Rawls may misdescribe an important motive for intergenerational saving. In theory, he famously describes the motive of saving in terms of regard that parents have for their children, actually fathers for their sons. He later revised this description for reasons we could discuss later. Still, many economists, notably Gary Becker and Amartya Sen, whose models are otherwise quite different, represent savings for the future as a form of consumption, right, pursued by individuals who have other-oriented desires to improve the circumstances of life for future persons. As a parent myself, I certainly have such desires. I think they're much more powerful than other more self-oriented desires might be. Even in theory, where he includes this intergenerational parental motivational assumption, Rawls assumes that saving is a cost rather than a benefit for those who engage in it. And while I'm not generally an advocate of Becker's models, it does seem to me that even in his earlier work, Rawls may underestimate the benefit that's achieved by earlier generations, by activities that result in intergenerational saving. Why does Rawls revert to an adequacy or sufficiency condition in this area of his theory, as it seems to me he does? I think there are several important reasons. First, some forms of interaction are not possible between generations. We can't face the members of distant future generations as social equals. Certain other kinds of morally significant reciprocity relations are possible among contemporaries, but not between persons who exist at different times. It seems to me that what Gina Schouten called yesterday the distributive demands of mutual respect include at least some aspects that can't easily be expressed by persons who are not contemporaries with one another. Beyond this, Rawls follows Mill, and actually references Mill in this section of Law of Peoples especially, Mill argues that the comparative value of liberty as compared to material goods, even primary goods, will decrease dramatically once a threshold has been met. Rawls quotes Mill in several different points here. He expresses agreement with Mill's account of the stationary state in Mill's Principles of Political Economy. This is from correspondence with Philippe van Parijs. He says, so you see, I'm not happy about the globalization of the banks and businesses are pushing it. I accept Mill's idea of the stationary state as described by him in Book 4, Chapter 6 of PPE. And I'm adding this in a footnote. You can find it in footnote 15. Though I think the letter is interesting. It makes it much clearer. He says, I'm under no illusion that its time will ever come. That is, the time for the stationary state will ever come. Certainly not soon, but it's possible. And hence, it has a place in what I call the idea of a realistic utopia. Then in Law of Peoples, he also references a well-known passage that reflects Mill's own defense of resource sufficiency as an ideal. In Principles of Political Economy, Mill writes, after the means of subsistence are assured to the next in strength of the personal wants of human beings is liberty. And unlike the physical wants, which as civilization advances become more moderate and amenable to control, it increases instead of diminishing in intensity as the intelligence of the moral faculties are more developed. The perfection both of social arrangements and practical morality would be to secure to all persons complete independence and freedom of action, subject to no restriction but that of not doing injury to others. This is from PPE and not from On Liberty. Rawls quotes this passage with approval, but of course he didn't accept Mill's position as it stands. Sufficiency is not an adequate ideal for intragenerational justice, and Mill's subsistence needs are much too ascetic for Rawls' index of primary goods. Now, I'm arguing that sufficiency or adequacy has a role to play, an important role to play, in Rawls' theory of saving, but I don't mean to reduce Rawls' view to a simple sufficiency requirement. Rather, it seems to me that the reasons for protecting adequate provision differ from the reasons for protecting more fully described circumstances of justice. And I find that this difference is expressed in several places in Rawls' own work. Sufficiency has notable contemporary defenders, but perhaps it's not a popular ideal. Some writers, including Richard Arneson, take it to be an immoral or inconsistent ideal, and others, including Paula Casal, persuasively argue that sufficiency is not enough for justice. And I agree. But different claims often depend on the way a sufficientarian requirement is expressed. It's noteworthy that Rawls' intergenerational sufficientarianism, like Mill's, definitely doesn't recommend that we maximize, say, the number of people who rise to the sufficiency level. I think this is one of the reasons Arneson's critique of sufficientarianism misfires. It aims at the wrong target. It is a negative ideal to address deprivation due to insufficiency. This formulation avoids a number of objections that face some alternative sufficientarian requirements. Rawls doesn't settle precisely at which rate earlier generations might save for the benefit of providing later generations with this adequate provision. How much can we expect those who live in unjust or imperfectly just societies, people like ourselves, how can we expect them to save in order to secure better institutions for others? It might be consistent with Rawls' views to seek an answer to this question in the underlying conditions of life that are supposed to be secured by just institutions. Just institutions, he says, are not designed to make people happy or wealthy. Instead, they seek to secure circumstances that exclude the possibility that people would face deprivation that would exclude the possibility of a worthwhile life. We might operationalize a reasonable principle, perhaps by stipulating that the worse-off generations should save at a rate that would maximally reduce deprivation, regardless of the time at which that deprivation takes place. Such a principle would describe an atemporal objective, aiming toward an ideal that has, as Rawls wrote, a place in a realistic utopian ideal. But would such a rule demand too much? If this ideal is utopian and never to be achieved in reality, saving is a very definite real cost for those who engage in it. If saving is too much to ask, one might incorporate the thought that it's permissible to save at a lower rate to urge that agent-centered restrictions license such a lower rate. And that suggestion was made by Kenneth Arrow in a discussion of sacrifice and saving appropriate in the context of climate change. If we move from consideration of ideal circumstances to that of much less ideal circumstances, we might think we can justify a higher rate of saving in unequal societies like our own, since it might be possible to impose the burden of saving on those who are better off, avoiding the imposition of this burden on those who are worse off. But to engage this move is immediately to invoke the trade-off between intratemporal and intertemporal requirements of justice. In a just society, inequalities would make it possible to save without inequalities that would make it possible to save without imposing burdens on the worst-off members are likely to be unjust inequalities that would not exist if our present circumstances were better than they actually are. I don't have a simple proposal to resolve this problem, so I raise it simply to indicate an area of uncertainty. It seems, however, that we might rule out extremes from the start. Existing practices arguably reflect an excessive rate of dis-saving for both resources and capital, which imposes an unreasonable risk of harm on future generations. I think it's worth comparing Rawls' view to other relevantly similar views that treat the same problem. Robert Solow famously argues that earlier generations have an obligation to pass on to future generations a resource base that provides them with opportunities for well-being that are comparable to the opportunities enjoyed by the present generation. And following Solow, John Hartwick worked out the rate of investment that's necessary precisely to offset declining resource stocks so that consumption will not fall from present to future generations. The Solow-Hartwick view is less demanding, much less demanding than Rawls' view, since Rawls' view implies in our non-ideal circumstances that we should engage in positive saving at present in order to leave future generations a social world that's better than our own. Passing on a merely, undepleted stock may be absolutely inadequate under our circumstances. Amartya Sen urges a more demanding ideal that's closer to the one recommended by Rawls. According to Sen, we should pursue future-oriented policies that aim to preserve and, when possible, to expand people's substantive freedoms and capabilities without compromising the capabilities of future generations to have similar or increased freedoms. Sen's criterion is evidently framed after Solow's, he says so himself, but it incorporates also aspects of the Brundtland Report view that we should seek to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Sen's criterion, however, is open-ended and I think perhaps pro-natalist in a way that Rawls' view, as I've interpreted it here, is not. The objective to secure adequate opportunities is a satiable ideal, while Sen's freedoms, as I understand, are not similarly satiable. We can always imagine circumstances in which we have greater capability or more real freedoms than we have at present. In the final part of my remarks today, I'd like to relate Rawls' account of intergenerational saving to the very active discussion of population paradoxes, instigated in part by Derek Parfit and followed through in Professor Dasgupta's forthcoming book in interesting ways. It might seem to Rawlsians that the discussion of population paradoxes is exclusively relevant to consequentialists, and that Rawlsians might therefore avoid engaging this discussion. I think Elizabeth Anderson has a remark where she implies that. But I think it's a mistake. I think Rawls expressly discusses the total and average views in 1971. He's partly responsible for setting the stage of the consequentialist debate, and he clearly did not view this as an aspect of the debate that could simply be set aside. Rawls clearly says that consequences matter from the moral point of view, that any view that ignored them would be crazy, and these issues finally are unavoidable since the circumstances of life for future generations depend in important ways on what we save or destroy, and because population consequences matter for justice and for well-being. For a variety of reasons, I believe that the best understanding of Rawls' view will make him a personalist in the language of the population debate. But it's been argued, notably by Derek Parfit, John Broome, and our own Partha Dasgupta, that personalist theories are incoherent because they describe an intransitive ordering over the set of possible outcomes. Broome and I believe Dasgupta regard this to be a decisive objection to any personalist account of population. I'm not going to rehearse this argument here. Instead, I'll just respond to it in a sense. But if you wish to rehearse it, I'll put a brief version of it on the board here. Broome understands a theory of good to be an ordering over the set of possible worlds in terms of a betterness relation, or an at least as good as relation. And he may be correct when he argues that no intransitive relation can be the comparative of a real property. For the purposes of a theory of justice, however, We don't need a fully articulate theory of impersonal good, what Broom is looking for. We might be skeptical about the very idea of impersonal good, in fact. Instead, what we need is followable principles, a decision procedure, in fact, that tells us what course of action or which policies will appropriately protect people's rights, promote the goal to ensure that citizens face one another as equal members. The goal in this case is given by the reasons that we have, in contrast to Broom's view that our reasons should follow from our articulate and fully described image of impersonal good. Given a finite set of alternatives, a personalist view like the one I would like to attribute to Rawls will identify policy actions that are permissible, the best set, if you will, within a larger set of available alternatives. The goal to reduce deprivation so that fewer people will suffer consequences such that they lack reasonable opportunities for a worthwhile life will not yield an implausible or repugnant development path. Indeed, one might see that principle in the development path it describes as a reasonable compromise in circumstances where there is little prospect, as Broom himself would acknowledge, to settle the question how we might act to produce the highest impersonal good. Perhaps this is enough, and that's where I'll end. So, thank you.
So let me begin by following Clark in thanking the organizers and Michael for putting on what has been a fantastic conference up until now. And since it's towards the end, I hope there's a limit to how much damage I can do to this. So I would like to speak to you about Rawls' theory of intergenerational justice. And the question I want to ask is it a theory of intergenerational justice? And I want to suggest that as it stands, it's not clear, so I'm going to try to explain to you why I think it's not clear and what would have to happen to make it clearer. So if you think about your duties or the duties we could possibly have to future generations, there are three ways to think about it. So first of all, we could think, well, do we have duties of, as I was just saying, duties of justice to future generations, which would imply direct duties to future generations, and it would mean that future generations have claims against us. There are many ways to think that that is very difficult in the case of non-existing future generations to make that claim of justice. So there are two other ways to think of our duties to future generations. The second way is to say, well, we have duties of justice to our contemporaries regarding future generations, or meaning we have duties towards our contemporaries that have particular effects on future generations. So it's not future generations who can claim anything from us in terms of justice, but what we do with our contemporaries has effects on them. That's the second way we could think about future generations. And the third way would be to say, well, it's really, really difficult to establish duties of justice to future generations. Perhaps it's impossible. So, but we do think we owe things to future generations, but what we owe to them are moral requirements. Moral requirements of the kind that we might think we owe to distant strangers in terms of humanitarian aid. And maybe that's how we relate to future generations. Now, Rawls seems to have seen himself firmly located in the first camp. And he seems to have felt that he was writing a theory of intergenerational justice. But it's not really clear that this is what happened, and it's not clear for reasons of, A, some of the things he said himself, some of the things he said were contradictory. I will mention some of those. But much more importantly than some of the things he says is what he doesn't say. And what he doesn't say is he at no point spells out how he sees or how he views our relationship to future generations. More specifically, he never spells out whether the relationship we have to future generations is the kind of cooperation required for triggering duties of justice. So you have to explain that because it is not obvious. If we ask that question, well, is our relationship to future generation the kind of cooperation that would trigger these duties of justice for someone like Rawls? The obvious answer seems, well, no. Obviously, no, because there is no reciprocity between the generations. So it doesn't seem that we can cooperate with them at all. Now, I should qualify this claim in light of Samuel Scheffler being here, because you have recently claimed that there is reciprocity between the generation. You call it evaluative reciprocity. Now, that's an asymmetrical and sort of unconventional kind of reciprocity, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. What I would like to focus on today is to say sort of the symmetrical, conventional kind of reciprocity, that doesn't hold between the generations. And assuming that is the case, is there a way to fill in the gaps that Rawls left to make it the case that he ends up with a theory of intergenerational justice? And what I'll try to do is explore what he'd have to say, or what one would have to say, to fill in the gaps of what he didn't say. So my talk is going to be in 3 steps. First, I'm going to quickly run through what most of you will be very familiar with, the just savings principle. We've heard Clark speak about it very quickly, just to flag where I see some of the problems. And then I'm going to take my second step to spell out the kind of cooperation I think Rawls saw herself as engaged with future generations, and how that kind of cooperation may generate duties of justice. And then I'll, in the third step, quickly say what that means for the just savings principle, how we are to understand that. So the just savings principle. Rawls says that to determine what we owe to future generations, we ask ourselves, or we put ourselves in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, where we don't know which generation we are from, but we do know that we are all from the same generation. That's what he's called the present time of entry assumption. And then we ask ourselves, what would we have wanted previous generations to save for us? And the answer will generate the just savings rate, namely the rate, the way that we should justly distribute the costs of, and now comes what we owe to future generations, of establishing and maintaining just institutions over time. Now, he thought this came in 2 phases. In the phase where we are not where society is in a stage where just institutions have not been established yet, that's where we have to save. And once just institutions have been firmly established, they have to only, I should say, be maintained, and then Rawls thought no further saving is going to be required. And then he provides another answer, and he says, well, how are these costs to be distributed intragenerationally? And there he says, well, the just savings principle acts as a constraint on the difference principle. It's not entirely clear what that's supposed to mean. There's a stronger and a weaker reading. In the stronger reading, we might say, we can't maximize the position of the worst off until we have done what is required by the savings principle. And a slightly weaker version would be, we maximize the position of the worst off as long as that doesn't interfere with our saving for the future. Maybe they are more similar than I'm making them out to be. I'm going to get back to that a little later. So note 2 things about this. So the first thing to note is that, well, I've told you this already, but he says nothing about what our relationship to future generations is in this spelling out of the savings principle. Now the thing is, this wasn't always the case. The version of it I presented to you is the revised version from Political Liberalism. Originally, he approached the savings principle a little bit different, and it's illuminating because his original answer actually does say something about how he thinks we relate to future generations. So originally, in the theory of justice, he first visits this question of intergenerational justice in the context of discussing the circumstances of justice. So he says the circumstances of justice, he takes these from Hume largely, and he says it's, as you know, moderate scarcity, limited altruism, and then the difficult case of future generation, relative equality. Once he spelled these out, he says, well, what does that mean for our duties to third parties such as our immediate descendants? So that clearly doesn't sound as if he's spelling out duties of justice. He's treating them as third parties. So he's saying, what does that mean? And another just little note, because he says third parties like our immediate descendants is a little bit puzzling, because of course immediate descendants would presumably also be part of our contemporary generation, in the sense that if we imagine the parties in the original positions, we don't only imagine one age cohort. We imagine grandparents, parents, children, and children's children. So immediate descendants will probably already be in there. But be that as it may. So he's asked, how do we imagine our duties to third parties? And then he says, well, the only way at that point in a theory of justice, he could see that could happen is to have a so-called, what he called the motivational assumption. Namely that he changed the parties in the original position from completely disinterested parties to family heads of families, who would have a motivation to want to save for their descendants. Now that move did two things. The important move for my purposes is it firmly located Rawls in that second category of ways to think about future generations, namely the category that says, it's not that we owe them anything directly by means of justice. We have duties, we create the original position in a way, or we formulate the constraints in a way that in the original position we owe each other duties of justice that then have repercussions on the future. So clearly he says, well, I'm not doing a theory of justice directly because I can't. I'm making this motivational assumption. Now, the motivational assumption also did something else later on, which is it was supposed to explain why, if we all are contemporaries of each other, why we would save at all, or why it would be in our interest to save. Because, as he says in a theory of justice, we'll have to assume past generations will have either saved or they haven't saved. Nothing that we do will change that. So our interest in saving is very minimal. So that's what the motivational assumption was also supposed to address. For that, he was heavily criticized, and so Jane English was saying that's a strange assumption for him or question to be raising for him because his theory is firmly located in ideal theory, so why does he have to worry about non-compliance? In response to several of these objections to the motivational assumptions, he took it out. And what we were left in political liberalism is this very short passage where he corrects that and he says, we ask this other question, namely, what would we have wanted previous generations to leave for us? Now that comes at a cost because here he now loses every kind of location in what of these three categories I mentioned before he ends up being. He says nothing anymore. This question of what would previous generations have done doesn't say anything about why we should save for future generations. It kind of assumes that we should, but it doesn't say anything about why. So that's what I'm going to be trying to, what would he have to say to make good on the claim that he actually has a theory of justice. I want to note one more thing. You will also note when I said what has to be left, the stuff that is supposed to be left for future generations, isn't the usual kind of stuff that is subject to distribution for Rawls. So it's not that we leave them the fruits, their fair share of the fruits of our cooperative labor, as we would do with our contemporaries. What we leave to future generations is we share the costs fairly across generations of establishing and maintaining just institutions. That's very different. And on the face of it, you might say, well, that sounds like the duty of assistance, the duty we owe to distant strangers. Sounds exactly like it. And in fact, in the Law of Peoples, on page 107, he has a very short he draws a parallel between the savings principle and the duty of assistance to distant strangers. Not that he says it's the same thing, but he says they function the same way, they work the same way. That's why he draws the parallel. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about this, but I'm going to give you one reason why this can't be the moral requirement. The savings principle can't be the kind of moral requirement that the duty of assistance is. Now, recall that the duty of assistance requires well-ordered societies to assist burdened societies in the establishment of just institutions. The savings principle asks a previous generation, to help establish or maintain just institution, or share the costs of maintaining and establishing just institutions for the next generation. That, translated into well-ordered and burdened societies, means that the savings principle requires burdened societies to save for slightly less burdened societies, assuming that future generations usually are wealthier, and further along in establishing just institutions, since they're well further along in history. And in the international realm, asking burdened societies to help slightly less burdened societies wouldn't generate any moral obligations. So if it was parallel to the duty of assistance, the just savings principle wouldn't even get off the ground. Okay, but what I really want to do is explain why I think that that Rawls had a view of intergenerational cooperation that is non-reciprocal, but that still is of a kind that it would trigger duties of justice to future generations. While Rawls didn't write a lot about future generations, I mean, I can count the number of pages in my hands, maybe one hand, oh, maybe I'll need my second hand, but not many pages. But his work, all of his work is littered with references that what he sees his project as being, as spelling out what is required for building just background institutions for societies. Not a generation, not one generation, societies, which he saw as trans-temporal entities, that is generation over generation over generation. So he had the project of spelling out justice for contemporaries, but he also was pointing towards this other sort of cooperation, a cooperation across time. So the pie baking analogy is often used to explain his duty of justice among contemporaries. So if that's good for that, I'll use this. So the cooperation among contemporaries means, split up the pie so that everybody who contributes to it gets their fair share. The other sort of cooperation I'm pointing to would mean I'm committed, or Rawls is committed to endlessly reiterated, or maybe not endlessly, but for a while reiterated pie baking, and now you want to set up a structure that allows this reiterated pie baking. In the same sense that, for instance, we might imagine certain things that people build. I mean, there are certain things that people can build within a generation, but there are other things that people build together that you can't build in a generation. Gaudi's Church of the Holy Family, that you couldn't finish in a generation. The Great Wall of China is one of the projects that you have to build. You build together, you build over generations. So you cooperate, but it's not reciprocal. One generation, you're in this boat together, you're building this over many generations. But yes, so you are cooperating, but it's non-reciprocal. Now the question is why from that, if you're with me that this is part of his vision, this just backgrounds institution for trans-temporal societies, meaning over generations, where might claims of justice arise? Now, I want to suggest that there are ways in which generations are bound to each other, so that future generations are uniquely vulnerable to previous generations in ways that require previous generations to justify some of their actions to future members of their society. Because they're involved in this project, in this overarching project, to build and maintain just institutions across a longer time span. Now, I'll tell you, and these are going to be in many ways obvious ways in which previous generations influence or have pervasive effects on the life prospects of future generations. And well, I'll start that way, and you'll first not be convinced at all because you'll say, well, that's how it is. It's like getting upset about the laws of gravity. That's what happens. But I'll try to make my case more specific after I've laid down the sort of generally an intuitive way that this happens. So let me mention 3 ways in which previous generations or in which we have pervasive effects on the life prospects on future members of our society in particular. So I'm not mentioning a big problem like climate change, because that's a global problem. So I'm talking about domestic issues. So one thing we share, of course, is since we didn't heed Thomas Jefferson's advice and rewrite our constitution, or your constitution, I'm not American, but the US Constitution every 19 years, what contemporary Americans share with previous Americans are sort of general structures like the Constitution, like the political system of a constitutional federal representative democracy, the capitalistic market economy. Those sort of in general. Those have pervasive effects on future generations. And it's not that each generation reinvents it. It is set on the path that previous generations put them on. And this is what is it, aggravated is kind of the wrong word, but with a political culture that builds in the history and a shared history over time. Now, I don't have a great example for that, but one thing that came to mind in America, that this very forceful psychology of the American dream, for instance, which has influenced generations of Americans, opened doors for some of these dreamers and frustratingly shut them for others in ways that wouldn't be easily translatable to another society. That is something particular American, and a way in which previous generations kind of hold future generations in their grip in a way, because it's not, you don't reinvent these things, you take them over, those are the burdens of growing up with your parents and in on the back of other generations. And the third way I want to mention, and there are many more, would be, and you might find this a little fanciful, but of course previous generations, they determine the kinds of spaces, physical spaces, that later generations think within. So there's a German psychologist who wrote about how these spaces influence, the spaces that are created by past generations influence the rooms of thinking we have. So his name is Alexander Mitscherlich, and I'm just going to very badly quote this, what he described about, he was worried about the way the cities were built at the time. And he was saying putting employees behind uniform glass facades, and then in their private lives forcing them to live in monotonous blocks of flats, completely creates a situation where even thinking about democratic freedoms or planning for democratic freedoms becomes illusionary. So that, I'm just saying that the way that our cities are built, the way that these spaces are created, that into which everybody is born, has a pervasive impact on who we end up being, what we end up being able to think. Now, I'm making this the connection to institutions by saying that there are certain limits then in what you can imagine in the kind of institutions you envision for yourself. So all of these ways we are influenced by past generations, what they did. We're set on a path, and of course we can break with them at any point, right? We are free in that sense. But breaking this path is costly, comes with tremendous cost. So that, and here is where I see the problem. So in that the past generations, because we are in this project together, and because each generation has to assume the fair share of the costs, that if these costs become disproportional, that is a sign that a previous generation hasn't assumed their fair share of this cost. So the previous generation is in need of some justification to us, to the future, when we, to the next future generations, for what we leave them. So their non-reciprocal vulnerability to our, some have called this intergenerational potential for intergenerational domination, that's what generates the justice claims. Now, you might immediately say, and I flagged this already, that, well, there's something inevitable about this, completely inevitable, like the laws of gravity. It's not that we are like eels. Joseph Heath has used this example where when one generation, new generation comes, the other generation dies and presumably takes everything with them. We don't burn our libraries when we go. We don't eradicate our computers, our knowledge and stuff. We leave everything to future generations. So how can that be a subject of justice if that is so inevitable? So this is granted. Some of this is inevitable. But just because some of it is inevitable doesn't mean that all of it is. And I want to suggest that there are ways in which one generation can, I want to say unjustly, encroach on a further generation. And I'll give you an example that comes from, that I've used in my work on climate justice. And I'm going to use that example, which doesn't immediately translate to institutions, but it can easily be translated. So suppose somebody 100 years ago poisoned a well or body of water, and or 150. Let's make it 150 years ago. So definitely non-overlapping. And this was well known that it wasn't a secret act. Now, if somebody today drinks of this well and is poisoned, it would be very hard to say that who is to blame for this person's poisoning. Well, it's the person 150 years ago who's causally responsible for having poisoned the well. Because you'd say, well, yeah, somebody 150 years ago poisoned that well, but in the meantime, the current generation, this was a public act, the current generation is fully responsible for not having signposted it properly, or cleaned the well up, or done other things to prevent people today from dying from suffering. So the responsibility for this, the moral responsibility for something somebody causally did 150 years ago, clearly must lie within one generation. That doesn't go across generations. It's not as if people blame past generations for Hurricane Katrina, although many people attribute it to climate change. That climate change, if it was climate change, was clearly done by people from past generations, even from other countries, and still the report, A Failure of Initiatives, blames the American government for not reacting quickly enough. Well, if we're going to transgenerationally start attributing blame, that would be ridiculous. But I'm saying it isn't ridiculous. Of course the American government was to blame, because even if climate change was at fault, and even if past generations were at fault of climate change, it's still fully responsible of the contemporary generation to make sure nobody drinks of poisoned wells, and what happens, and that people don't die if a hurricane hits New Orleans and the levees break. So, in those normal circumstances, I think my argument doesn't get off the ground. But now consider this. Somebody drinks of the well, and suppose the reason that somebody drinks of the poisoned well is because there is no more water in the world. And then, so there isn't anything, okay, so there are two ways that this could happen. So somebody drinks of the well, says, I had to drink because there wasn't any water. There are two reasons why there might not be any water, or clean water, non-poisoned water. First reason is, there kind of is enough clean water to go around in the world, but it's badly distributed. So it's true that this individual had to drink from the poisoned well because that individual didn't have water. But the fault, again, lies with his contemporaries or her contemporaries because they distributed the water that there is on the planet wrongly. So again, you can't blame past generations. But there is one situation where you could blame past situation, and that is if the person drank of the poisoned well because there really wasn't any more water. And there really wasn't anything that the current generation was able to do. And now climate change is one of these cases where this is something that past generations unfortunately can do. They can influence the future in a way that future generations won't be able to reverse in the normal way that we think generations are free to reverse all of their predecessors' choices. So in the same way, again, this comes from a different topic, but with institutions it could be the same. If you worry about institutions, the way I've described the way institutions influence future generations, you could say is it innocuous? I mean, that's a normal way. Maybe it creates more costs for future generations to maintain just institutions or to establish just institutions. But maybe those are just the costs that it costs to be a later generation. There are lots of benefits about being a later generation, and there are costs involved. So no big deal. But there are certain, that's where the justice claim comes in. There are certain unjustified costs previous generations can impose on future generations. So if, for instance, I'm thinking of the German case now because I'm German, you could imagine a generation where you know that if you don't heavily invest in education or a certain sort of education and put some emphasis on remembrance, that there will come a time where, for instance, in Germany, the atrocious past will become a thing of the past, no longer remembered. And then fascist forces, and the door will open. I mean, some of this is maybe happening right now in Europe or Germany. Certain forces, fascist forces, can get a hold again of society because the remembrance and the remembrance of how important certain liberal institutions are, the preamble of the German Constitution. If you, for instance, if a generation just neglects that and forget and doesn't invest at the right moment, or maybe at the last moment, where this trend could be turned around and where you could, maintain the bulwark against certain influences that might undermine the further establishment or maintenance of just institutions. That's when a generation fails the future. Because the future then, I'm assuming, then it will be too late. Like in the sense where we often think of climate change, certain things are too late. With institutions, it can be this, you can also come to a point where something can be too late. A previous generation just hasn't taken its job in this chain of generations of helping establish and maintaining future just institutions across time seriously enough. And that's where I think the justice comes in. And so if I'm suggesting that if Rawls said something like that, I don't think Rawls would have said anything like that. But this would be a way on not completely un-Rawlsian terms, in terms of cooperation. We accept that there's no reciprocity. We do take seriously what I think is a Rawlsian project named the transgenerational cooperation, and how that could yield just certain justice claims. And it would mean for the savings principle, basically, well, that each generation assumes its costs, its fair share of the costs of this project, namely maintaining and establishing and maintaining just institutions over time. And that's what the saving would consist of, namely then investing in, for instance, civic education, infrastructure, whatever it is required to take up their fair share of these costs. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you very much for 3 extremely stimulating talks. I was told by the organizers of the conference that it's my brief as chair to ask one question of each of the participants, of each of the speakers, to get the debate started. My response was only one, but I'm going to try and exercise extreme restraint and stick to my brief. So first, a question for you, Partha. So according to your wealth, well-being equivalence theorem, inclusive wealth and social well-being are 2 sides of the same coin. So inclusive wealth, defined as the social worth of the sum of our capital goods, is analytically equivalent to social well-being, defined as a society's well-being across time. And as you point out, exploiting this equivalence, we can, for example, measure social well-being indirectly by taking stock of a society's inclusive wealth. So that now you tie this very interesting result, the wealth well-being equivalence theorem, to a Rawlsian framework. And so here's my question. It's a very simple one. Translated into Rawlsian terminology, the inclusive wealth which a society disposes of is a function of its stock of primary goods. But as Rawls emphasizes, it's a mark of primary goods that they're what he calls all-purpose means. They can be put to many different uses depending on people's ends given to them by their conception of good and their plan of life. So for a given stock of primary goods, there's a multiplicity of possible future uses. A bundle of Rawlsian primary goods, we might say, corresponds to an opportunity set of possible uses of these all-purpose means. So that raises a question. When you say that we can indirectly measure a society's social well-being over time by looking to its stock of primary goods, how do we deal with this fact of multiplicity, that one and the same stock of primary goods could be put to very different uses? So this is just a simple clarificatory question. But before you answer, I have a question for Anja and Clark as well. So what struck me about your 2 talks, and what I found so fascinating, is that although you were both talking about Rawls's just savings principle, you have rather different readings of Rawls. So to give just one example, consider the quite different explanations that you both offered for why, according to Rawls, intergenerational savings can be divided into what he calls accumulation phase, followed by a steady state phase. So Clark, for you the answer is a function of the distributive principle that Rawls endorses for the intergenerational case. So on the picture you gave us, whereas relations with our contemporaries, the intragenerational case, are governed by egalitarian principles of distribution, the distributive principles governing what we owe to posterity are sufficientarian in character. They aim at the minimization of deprivation. So as you put it, the purpose of saving is to ensure that fewer people will suffer deprivation in later generations than in earlier ones. But once sufficiency has been achieved and no one is deprived of the opportunity for worthwhile life, saving may drop to zero. Now, Anja, your answer was quite different. For you, the distinction between the accumulation phase and the steady state phase is to be explained not as the consequence of adopting a special sufficientarian distributive principle for the intergenerational case, but rather as a consequence of the objective of saving for the future. So on your reading, the objective of just savings for Rawls is distinctly institutional. We're required to save for posterity, not in order to improve the material conditions of life for our descendants quite generally, but much more specifically and narrowly in order to establish and maintain just institutions over time. Right? So as you said, the stuff comprising the savings consists of the various resources needed to establish such just institutions. And should it turn out that such just institutions have already been established, no further saving is required. We fully met the objective underlying the imperative to save, not just well enough, so to speak, but really completely. Okay, so this is like a really interesting difference of emphasis between your two talks, I thought. So against that background, I have a quick question for each of you. So first to you, Clark. So as Anja brought out really nicely in her talk, I think there is at first blush a puzzle about why we should have a duty of justice to save for future generations. I think that's true both on formal grounds. It's not clear at first blush whether we are in any relevant sense engaged in a kind of cooperative enterprise with later generations that could straightforwardly give rise to questions about justice. But there's also a substantive puzzle, namely this. Given rising standards of living over time, the worst off members of the present generation are quite conceivably worse off than their future counterparts will be. So if saving for the future comes at the expense of our worst off contemporaries, and these are also absolutely worst off people in an intergenerational context, then saving for the future may seem hard to justify, right? And Anja has a nice and simple answer to this question. So she calls, again, attention to the objective of intergenerational savings, which, once again, is to establish and maintain just institutions over time, to protect the people's equal basic liberties over time, right? So on that reading, the just savings principle, we might say, is the way the liberty principle works itself out in an intergenerational context. And because the liberty principle for Rawls has lexical priority over the difference principle, it's clear why the imperative of just savings can appropriately constrain the difference principle. On the other hand, if, like you, Clark, we read just savings as justified essentially by the need to minimize deprivation over time, I think that the problem becomes more real, because we might then wonder if the justification for intertemporal savings really is just to minimize deprivation, then why not focus where deprivation is arguably the worst, namely amongst the worst off of our contemporaries? So that's the challenge to you. And then very briefly for you, Anja, so unlike Clark, you seem to maintain that the just savings principle is to be understood primarily in negative terms. Like, just don't mess things up for posterity, leave them enough of the resources that they need to build or maintain just institutions. There's less of an emphasis on positive accumulation. My only question is, do you view that as a separable commitment of your reading of Rawls, or do you think that's really part and parcel of your institutional reading? So those are my three questions to our panel.
Perhaps we should start.
Right, okay, yeah. Wow, this is, I think every attempt I've read of building a moral theory or ethical theory on opportunities, and exclusively opportunities, nothing but that's the, if you like, the elements of the theory, run into a severe problem, which is you don't know the content of these opportunities without having some valuation of the contents. You can have completely worthless opportunities, objects there, and then you wouldn't be able to discriminate. Some people have tried to count the number of alternatives. I mean, okay, I mean, you can see how absurd it could be. So my reading of not Rawls. I mean, I'm not here to do that. It's just that I think of course, he didn't know the equivalence theorem.
Yes.
So you can't blame him for making a mess of his statements regarding the primary goods. But I know what the primary goods are, which are the ingredients of the capital assets. So the equivalence theorem is directing us to the point that when the veil is very thick, you really don't know what inclusive wealth is. Because you don't know what the possibilities are, even about yourself, the details of yourself. And I want to come back a little bit, if you don't mind, to having an interchange with the other two regarding the interpretation of his. So, and as the veil becomes less thick, it becomes more clarified. But the virtue of the wealth is the fact that you're actually talking about the options within the opportunity sets. Because without that, every attempt that's been made, it's very attractive to talk in terms of opportunities as being the primitive of a theory of. It runs into really impossibilities. I think in coaching, the one additional point I'd like to make in addressing is I think Rawls's initial intuition of having a motivational assumption was exactly right. And because it's all very well to say you don't have knowledge about your specifics behind the veil of ignorance, but you sure as hell know you're a human being. And if you know you're a human being, you know that on the pretty huge chance you will want, you'll care about your children. I mean, it's a pretty reasonable bet. And as a father and grandfather now, I think to me, these emotions are so deeply ingrained in the human condition that to pretend that I'm going to be dispense with that would seem to me to be a questionable move. Now, the problem with Rawls's initial framing of the savings principle was that he talked about this was the days when you talked about fathers, not parents. Fathers care about that, and there were no daughters, father care about the sons. It's ambiguous here, because if you care about their well-being, your well-being depends on your children's well-being, then we have the potentials of a regress, of a recursion. Because your children are going to be caring about the well-being of their children. And that enabled, now I was too diffident at that stage to go that route, because in a few mathematical steps, which will involve some ethical assumptions, goes without saying, you're going to get a utilitarian formulation, okay, by separability and so forth. And I thought it was so foreign to Rawls's book that I didn't go that route. Instead, I literally interpreted him as he put it, which is their standard of living, not their well-being, that I care about my consumption or my standard of living and my children's standard of living. So you've got a truncated picture of the intergenerational concern, but it does allow you to trigger off a savings, provided you don't go the Maximin route. And I didn't go the Maximin route. The Maximin route was followed by only Canaro, but not Solo, because he knew that wasn't on. Because it's a mathematically interesting problem, so he looked at it. But if you don't go but you have this truncated view, you can ask whether there is an equilibrium across the generations. And that's consistent with the reading that Katrina talked about, that there is the early Rawls had games in mind. So this we are looking at an intergenerational game, but children are included in the motivation of the parent. Now that had some problems, goes without saying, but it did give you a savings coming out endogenously without any forced. Yep. Of course, if you don't care about your children, then we're back to square one, and you need some additional machinery. Finally, the quotation from Sen on the on capabilities, I guess. The equivalence theorem says that your he's working on the social, the well-being space. But then there's a corresponding wealth space too, which will do the same work. Okay.
Well, I'll try to be quick. It seems to me that, there is this assumption in climate economics that later generations will be better off than previous generations, and it seems to me that I hope it's true. I hope later generations will be better off. On the other hand, I think our activity imposes very serious risks of that they won't be better off than we. I think the saving problem, as Rawls frames it, and as I've framed it in various places, doesn't incorporate that assumption at all, right? Whether future generations will be better off or worse off than we depends on what we do. It depends on what we save. Or, saving here is understood in a very broad sense. So as Partha pointed out, right, simply not using a stock or allowing a fishery to recover from the assault that we've inflicted on it is a form of saving for future generations. So what I'd want to say is, if it's true that saving imposes deleterious costs on the worst off members of the present generation, such that those who benefit really are better off, then that's unjustified on the view that I would describe.
Okay, so just quickly, because we don't have that much time, but it's a very good question. So I think it's separable in a sense. So you were asking me, is it that I interpret it mostly negative? I think that's just due to some of the substantive assumptions I was making about how I see generations relating, and that I generally think that, but it doesn't follow from the principle itself. It just follows from my assuming that generations basically can take care of themselves largely. And so if we owe anything, it's probably just going to be sort of we can't harm future generations, but the reduction of the negative aspects we have. And that if I was wrong about that substantive assumption, then we could have positive obligations, given what I said.
Wonderful. We started a little late, so we'll take about 25 minutes now for Q&A, and why don't we start with Arthur?
So, Anja, first, thank you for such an illuminating talk. Thank you for such an illuminating talk, Anja. My question is probably quite naive. I don't follow the intergenerational justice literature as carefully as I should. But why is the kind of built-in assumption that you can't have reciprocity because you can't wrong past generations? When you think of the interpersonal case, it does seem as if we have a certain kind of, there's a sense in which we have an atemporal existence. If one fails to honor a deathbed promise, in a sense that's perfectly sensible, we've wronged the dead person. If you destroy someone's brilliant manuscript and don't publish it when you should have, you've kind of wronged the past generation. So why do we just suppose right off the bat that a current generation can't, by destroying the collective inheritance or undermining or weakening the institutions, that they haven't in fact wronged the previous generation? And then you have an odd but kind of sensible form of reciprocity across generations that go both ways.
Can I immediately answer? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So
Put the microphones a little nearer to yourself.
like this?
Yeah,
Is that-
get near the microphone.
Okay, good. So yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I agree with you, and that's kind of flows into the evaluative reciprocity I think that Sam Schaffler thinks is between the generations. So the normal reason why people will think in the debate there is no reciprocity between generation has to do something, well, because Rawls started the whole thing with responding to the circumstances of justice, and in the circumstances of justice, the relative of power, since this comes from Hume, the kind of reciprocity that is denied is not the kind of reciprocity that you have in mind, but the reciprocity that isn't there because if we don't honor the death wish, well, what are they going to do, right? They can't come back and haunt, well, they can come, well, suppose they can't come back and haunt us. And the same is with the future, we mess up, and so what are they going to do to us? So that's, sort of non-metaphysical, we don't have physical conflict with them. If we don't have physical conflict, the circumstances of justice aren't there, and we don't have duties of justice to them.
You're not denying that you can wrong the past, but it isn't a form of reciprocity that you're talking about.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Gina.
So I found this three-way distinction of how we might account for duties of justice really interesting, and I was wondering if you could help me think through what's at stake in accounting for duties of justice to future generations in one of the justice ways rather than the plain old mundane ethical obligations way. And so suppose that, and I don't know if this is right, but suppose that we can't tell a story where the kind of cooperation that future generations can reciprocate does ground duties of justice. And so we have what Johann called the formal problem, right? So we don't really have circumstances of justice as they're sort of orthodoxly thought of here. And so we just say what we owe to future generations are ethical duties rather than specifically duties of justice. It seems like the reasons that we might want to hesitate to do that are maybe like what you said was that there's not really a parallel here with duties to distant strangers. But I'm not sure why we should think that our duties to future generations should be neatly in parallel with our duties to distant contemporaries. And then the other thing I can think of is just that we might think that they're less stringent if they're not duties specifically of justice, but I wonder if that's right. I mean, it seems like we might have duties of justice. Our failure to make good on is just as egregious a moral failure as if they were duties of justice. So we might have normal ethical duties that are just as stringent, just as compelling on us as duties of justice. And so if that's right, then I wonder if you can just help me see why we should particularly want to try to account for duties to future generations in one of the two justice ways rather than just as ethical, very stringent, demanding ethical obligations that we oughtn't to violate because they're very serious and they compel us very strongly, but they're not duties of justice.
Right. Yes. No. Very good. I've wondered about this myself at times, and I think, well, what's in a name, and then, but. So there are two reasons. So the reason I was pushing the justice reading right now is one thing specifically to Rawls, because I think that he wanted to make that claim of justice, and he wanted to make the connection that the two projects that I described, the cooperation intergenerationally and intergenerationally, are intimately connected. So there is some reason to want to account for them both under justice. If one is just a moral requirement, also that it's a constraint on the savings principle is a constraint on the difference principle is kind of difficult to interpret, because then it might not mean very much. If it is also a duty of justice, that creates a little bit of a tension there. And that's, I think, what Rawls intended. So that's not directly to answer, because that would be kind of Rawls in turn. So your question might be more general. Why in general? Would anybody in general insist that there are duties of justice versus moral requirements if they might amount to the same thing? Now, the only answer I can give to that is that one reason why you might insist that it's a duty of justice, even if the content sounds the same, if you were going to say something like we need to enforce it in some way today by, for instance, having representatives for future generations in parliaments, for instance. And then if you make the duty claim of justice, then they have claims against you that somebody can, a sort of a surrogate representative can make in their name, something like that, and then it would make a difference. If that's not what you have in mind, then I think you're right. Then you might say, what's in a name? So it's moral requirements. That doesn't change anything. It could be just as stringent. So if you have a particular purpose, then that's why I was pushing the duty of justice. But I think that you could make it into a moral requirement in a more general context. And yeah.
Can I say something brief about this? Because it seems to me that the circumstances of justice are misused in this context, and it's partly Rawls' fault. I think in Hume, the circumstances of justice are circumstances that explain and account for the fact that we acquire the concept of justice. You know, he distinguishes between the wall and the arch, right? And so the arch is a circumstance where each individual action contributes to a totality that has its own integrity. And I think we do have structures like that. We have cooperative structures that are intergenerational in that sense. And because of that, I think the concept of justice applies very neatly in intergenerational contexts in ways that perhaps Brian Barry and even Rawls didn't reflect in their work.
Tim Scanlon.
Thank you. Tim Scanlon. I have a technical question for Partha.
about the equivalency theorem, which probably is a mishearing on my part, and then a kind of, I'm sorry to say, moralistic observation about the more general question. The technical question is this: as Johann summarized the theorem, it's sort of analytically true that if we understand the value of the accumulated wealth in terms of the amount of well-being that it produces, then the decreases in well-being will be corresponding to decreases in wealth. But I thought I understood you when you initially presented it as saying that the accounting value of capital or wealth is the marginal contribution that it makes to well-being. And if that's the way we hear it, then it wasn't clear to me how the theorem seems more interesting but less obvious, because if a change in climate, for example, made it reasonable for us to invest more in existing agricultural technology, because in the more benign climate, we didn't need more tractors or fertilizer or whatever. But now circumstances, so that external factor might decrease well-being, but at the same time increase the marginal value of the capital goods. And so on that reading, it wasn't so obvious to me that the theorem was right. So that makes it a more interesting theorem, but maybe this is all based on confusion on my part. Can I say my other thing, or should I go on? So
I can answer the first part immediately.
Why don't you
haven't made a mistake. It's absolutely right.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll be interested to have it explained. So, okay, I'm glad to hear that. But all three of the panelists considered various different explanations for the intergenerational claims. One corresponding to Rawls's motivational assumption, based on concern for our immediate successors and their. Second, something like humanitarian duties to distant people to save them, and third, ties of justice due to some kinds of cooperation. The latter two are somewhat more controversial than the first one, right? It's hard to figure out exactly why do we have these duties? Are they the same people? And all questions come up, and similarly, we can argue about whether there is cooperation, so for the third. Whereas the first one has a kind of immediate motivational power, right? And so it's a thing about practical philosophy in general and practical philosophy that's often said we should talk about topics because they're important. So climate change is important. We ought to talk about it. But it's also true that when we talk about a topic, we talk about the aspects of it that are puzzling and controversial. And that's not a mistake on our part, because that's where we might make a marginal contribution. But on the other hand, in a political climate where if we concentrate on, well, what do we owe to these distant people, or do we really have cooperative connections with them, we allow people who don't want to think about climate change to think, well, it's controversial and it's puzzling. And also, if you look at it in terms of humanitarian, that puts it in the form of altruism.
Just pray
what are
that
we going to sacrifice for those people? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't say these things. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't say them, but I'm saying, and I'm not saying we should say anything we don't believe. But if we believe that the Rawlsian motivational approach, that is the immediate connection, is good as far as it goes, right? We shouldn't say, well, we're not going to talk about that because that's not to give a complete picture. So we're going to focus on these other things. Just politically speaking, it's not the best thing. I'm sorry, I'm sounding moralistic, but this is moralistic anti-moralism, because I think that we shouldn't put climate change in a moral framework. We should say, don't you care what happens to your children and grandchildren? So there isn't any worry about discounting. I mean, come on. Anyway, so that's my moralistic observation. We shouldn't throw cold water on the motivational assumption version just because it maybe doesn't give the complete picture.
So the first part, as I said, you got it absolutely right. The direction of change in the accounting prices bears a relationship, but not up and down with well-being. Obviously, it's triggering signals as to where the weaknesses lie and which are becoming scarcer and so forth. It goes without saying. You're quite right about it. Remember, we're talking about changes. We're not talking absolute. We're not saying wealth is the same as well-being. We're not saying that. It's just they move in tandem, provided you measure it. I think the motivational assumption is absolutely right, and I was saddened that John Rawls had dumped it in the 93 book. I received a copy of it from him in 93, I think it was. I've got it in my library. And I saw nothing in it, but because what I saw in it was something which is not going to get you anywhere, which is to say that each generation would be comfortable, whether it's looking back or looking forward, with what's on offer. But of course, that's just an equilibrium condition. It says nothing about the path that you're actually following. You need more material in your moral theory to be the motivation to get something going, because it'll be otherwise it's consistent with zillions of savings policies, which are equilibria. So I think I would stick to the direction that you're pointing to, because I would think that the motivation is exactly right. And that is, you do say, don't you care about your own children? Now, the trouble is, I think, one of the troubles is, because of these wretched externalities, which is, say, the climate change, I may care about my children and my great through recursion, recursive nature of the thing, care about my distant, and you might do that about yours, but you may not care that much about my descendants, and I may not care much about your descendants. Now, if you bear with me for a second, we economists, of course, have a way out of that by saying, well, create markets for everything. I mean, all these, if you can get rid of these externalities, then you have internalized these problems. So you don't need to care about, I mean, I don't need to care about Scanlon's descendants, and Scanlon doesn't have to care about my descendants. So long as we care about our own, it'll work out, roughly speaking. I mean, there are caveats here, by the way. But we don't live in that world. So therefore, we do need cooperation amongst the current people to have a savings policy, or in this case, less polluting policy, because there's these spillovers that are going on. And the moment that happens, then, of course, each is trying to free ride on the others. At the national level, it's quite clear it's happening. You do the savings, we do the polluting, so to speak. And so you have breakdowns in these negotiations, and that has been gone into quite a bit by economists. That's, as I understand, is the dilemma that you're pointing to.
Well, in the case of climate change,
yeah.
It depends whether you're talking about retarding the whole event or constraining its effects on you. So with respect to the climate, your children and my children are affected in the same bad way by the climate. Where it's a genuine public good. Whereas if we're talking about building walls, pardon the expression, to keep the sea out, we can say, okay, we're not going to worry about the climate change. We're just going to build walls around our country and let the other people get swept away. So that there you have
absolutely right.
Problem.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of, so as we're focusing on the general problem of contribution to climate change, we don't have to worry about that.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll start grouping questions together in groups of two. Two gentlemen sitting next to each other, David Estlin and Steve Dowell. You're next. Oh, okay. So, but Dave, you had a question. Yeah.
I have a question for Anja. I found the paper really to help me start thinking about what the question is about intergenerational justice, and this initial problem about how can we get duties of justice when there's not reciprocity put me in mind of the thought that there's two kinds of duties of justice. There's the duties of justice as a fair society system of cooperation. There's the natural duties of justice. There's a surprising amount of the way you wanted to handle this that might have been explained by the natural duty of justice. I don't expect this to succeed as a full-on interpretation of Rawls, but it seems to me it might get us more than you might think in what we want from a duties to future generations. It might seem to have one problem that famously it doesn't have the kind of particularity, as Simmons called it, of duties especially to one's own society, and it might seem like we're framing the problem in that way. But if, like Rawls, you just set the problem up as one society over time, then that's the form the question takes, and of course there may be duties to others as well. You might think it's also not a promising way to kind of answer the difficult question about what the rate would be, but it has to have some rate, and that's a hard question on either view. So as I say, I don't expect it to explain all the text. Sorry, one other thing it might explain is the rate could go to zero eventually because you've, protected the possibility of just institutions. And you did keep coming back to not the make the generations better off over time constantly, but protect their possibility of having just institutions. So where does this natural duty of justice stratagem run out? What do you think?
Oh, are you collecting or?
No, I will just go on that.
Oh, we'll just go on? Okay. May I say one just quick thing about the motivational assumption? Just one tiny thing, I'm sorry. Just one problem with the motivational assumption with a topic such as climate change is that even if you say, don't you care about your children? I mean, first of all, there are always going to be people in the room who said, no, I don't. But suppose they're not norm, but most people do care about their children. The climate change problem is something that could be delayed by generations. So it's very possible, if you think about climate change, that the next generations will be benefited if we don't stop climate change. And that the real problem will occur in very much more distant generations that there's no possibility we could really care about. So in many cases, you're absolutely right. That's to get it off the ground politically and to create that. But with climate change, unfortunately, that doesn't work so well because, again, those are so long-term effects.
Well, it will in a generation or two.
It will. Oh, well, yeah. Just wait. Yes. So, the natural duty of justice. Yes. So. That's also a difficult one. It goes into the question that I was asked before, that Gina asked. You get around a lot of the problems if you just say it's a natural duty of justice to care for future generations. Now, in this talk, I was trying to make the stronger claim that it's not just a natural duty of justice, but because that wouldn't have explained why it's not like the duty to assistance, because the duty of assistance to distant strangers is based on the natural duty of justice. And so that's why I insisted that it is a stronger duty, a duty of justice that is more intimately connected to the cooperation with contemporaries, and that's why I insisted on that. That's sort of the principled reason that it's closer to that. I didn't want to make it so separate because otherwise it looks like two different, completely different, inseparable projects. But I don't think Rawls wrote a theory of justice for one generation. I think he had in mind it is a duty of justice for a society, and a society is trans-temporal, and so then it is a duty of justice we owe future generations too. That was my thinking.
Okay. So I'll call next on Kenzie and then Paul.
Hi, Kenzie Bach. Thank you for such wonderful papers. I had a question about, obviously the climate change master case came up a lot. It's on all of our minds. Another sort of what we're doing for the future case that, in my view, has somewhat unfortunately taken over a particular segment of people's minds is this question about the existential threat to the human race that can then be addressed by pouring all of our money into colonizing Mars. The sort of and while I hesitate to spend our time on that here, I think the fact that it's a very well-resourced view of like what we should be doing about the future right now in a context in which unfortunately like specific wealthy individuals are increasingly able to set the course at which like we take a lot of our resources. It seems to me important to ask the question of, you know, none of your accounts were really dealing with the issue where it's not just about how much we save, but what resources within a Rawlsian framework do we have, or maybe do we need from outside a Rawlsian framework for talking to folks who are framing the issue as being one about the existence period of future generations and about therefore a kind of need for radical savings and investment. In some ways, this is just an intensification of Johann's point about that this is a situation where you could really divert resources from contemporary people who have justice claims in order to spend them all on preventing this existential risk. And it seems to me like that is a conversation that we have to be prepared to have in the public culture. And so I'm curious what you all would say about it.
Just one misconception, I think, could arise, which is when we say savings, the flip side is this savings. And dumping more carbon into the atmosphere now, that's dissaving, because I tried to argue show you that pollution is just the reverse side of conservation, and so those are assets that you're destroying, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb the material that you're dumping into it. So the savings issue is it has a very broad range of, including the points that Tim was alluding to, but that's included in it, because what we're doing here, if natural capital is actually being depleted, including ecosystems and so forth, then your net wealth might be actually declining without, if you haven't noticed, if you haven't kept that into account. And you look at a truncated version of the notion of wealth, you could be doing very well. And that puzzle is easily resolved by the discussion we've just now had. So we are talking about savings when we talk about climate change. One main problem here, at least in real politics, is the fact that it's a very asymmetric problem within the generations. So you were alluding to countries which have a high altitude as against those which are the Oceania, so they could be wiped out. But then, of course, the intra-national bargaining which is the problem that needs to be solved. Transfer of resources, as it were, from the rich to the poor, or the more vulnerable, less vulnerable to the more vulnerable.
All right, let's move on to power. Yeah, okay, then the last question over here.
Okay. I think that basic question here concerns two views, conflicting views on growth and eventual limit of growth. On the one hand, we have a modern paradigm that human power can secure unlimited growth, which means that every future generation needs to take care about itself because they will have the same starting point. The other perspective, limited growth, says, wait a second, growth are not unlimited. And I think that it goes to a very fundamental question of what is the relationship between nature on the one side and human world in general. Human world full of objects that we have discovered, picked up, selected, transformed, created, that they have market value and certain utility for us. Actually, Anja, your presentation brought me back to a beautiful passage in John Locke's second treatise on government that speaks about the creation of property in the state of nature. It exactly describes the situation that a man goes with a vessel to a source and gets the water, and that it is his own, and he can go to the market with it just to see what the price it has. The presumption, moral presumption of Locke is that there is an unlimited amount of this source, which means everybody else can do the same. So in the modern world, where nature was out there, we had unlimited amounts of water, maybe also light, warmth, and some other commodities. Economists in the area of development like to use the term externalization of costs and complains that obviously all raw materials traditionally were priced, so that this dichotomy between developed and developing can be maintained. So my question goes to, what is the solution? Is believing that we still can push the limits of nature further, maybe as international lawyers know very well, you have debates on the extraction of materials on bed of open seas, on oceans. You have debates on Arctica and territorial waters and so on and so forth. You have also cosmic law that tries to see whether where are the limits. On the other hand, we have to accept the fact that nature is now inside of our inhabited world. So that it leads me to a question and conclusion. On the one hand, we have an idea to create a new postmodern hydraulic society with world government, or enter to a social contract in which people are not only present as a partners, but they are also silent partners to this contract. The future and past generation. The question is how such a social contract can be enforced today.
Great. Last words, please.
Oh, wow. Sorry, this is going to be a very inadequate response to a wonderful set of observations you have made. You talk about limits to growth, but the question is growth in what? What object? And I think you have in mind something like total output or total human activity in some sense, and net of any depreciation, and that will be GDP. But I think we're gone beyond that. The talk that my lecture was addressing inclusive wealth, not GDP, because so you could think in terms of wealth potentially growing without jeopardizing nature, because nature is part of your wealth calculation. How far it can go, it's not for me to speculate. We certainly have a footprint which is now really dangerous at the moment. I mean, the estimates that scientists have, there's plenty of huge numbers, tons of studies of dying ecosystems or degraded ecosystems. So our footprint is now no ifs and buts about it. It's greater than one. We are taking out more than it can regenerate. I don't think that's how much more, we don't know. But you see, if you think of the amount of attention given to estimating GDP or amongst nations, across nations, or many of the other economic indicators, and think of the amount of money that's spent on that and the amount of care and attention given to that, as against the attention, care given to trying to estimate what our footprint is, how much are we taking off, or what the biosphere's ability is to regenerate itself, because it's a heterogeneous composition of ecosystems. It's pathetic, and that's why you're asking the question. It's absolutely pathetic because it's an underfunded area. There's only one research unit in the world which tries to estimate footprints. Now, talk to an economist, friends may immediately say, well, of course, that's terribly inaccurate. I mean, you can't believe the numbers, that's for sure. But do you spend money on something which is wrong, which is a misleading indicator, and try and refine it as much as you can, or do you work with whatever rough value you've got of something that is correct? That is to say, that's the right thing to measure, because you're trying to measure wealth, whether the stock, the biosphere is declining or not, and how much by. So we're in a mess. No ifs and buts about that. That's where you were asking the question. How far we can go, that comes later. At the moment, I think the first thing we have to do is to reorient the collection of statistics towards one which looks at natural capital, takes it seriously, and puts it on par with human capital and produced capital. That's for sure. But even that's going to prove extremely hard. It is proving very hard because we don't have very much in process. It's a very, very sad tale, at least as I see it, because I've tried to delve into the literature a lot, and there is really very little. That's hard. There are huge numbers of specific studies, for sure, plenty of them, very, very good ones, specific ecosystems. But putting them together to get a sense of the decline and improvements of various types, that's required. Governments don't even know the stocks of many of their, that constitute their wealth.
With my apologies to the 4 people still on the queue, we're unfortunately out of time. So let's thank our panelists for a really great session. Great.
Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Now I'm going to send you.